My name is David Staley, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of History. I've published 3 books. The first book I published was titled Computers, Visualization, and History, and I was very pleased that a year ago it came out in a second edition. And then about 5 years ago I published a book called History and Future, Using Historical Thinking to Imagine the Future. And in fact, I make the claim there that historians actually make very good futurists, in fact, better futurists than from a lot of other disciplines, I think. Just this past fall, I published a third book called Brain, Mind, and Internet, A Deep History and Future. And that book takes an important contemporary question, what is the internet doing to our brains, and places it in a wider historical context. And unlike others who are quite alarmed, they think, about the effects, both physiological and cultural, that the internet is having on our brains, I place that in a wider context and say that there's really nothing new or different here, that our cognitive tools, our cognitive technologies have always had an impact on our brain. The work I've been doing lately is to take historical data, turn it into visualizations, and then to turn those into physical objects, physical sculptures. So we recently did work visualizing an historical journal, the Florida Historical Quarterly. We looked at the top 100 terms that have appeared across the 85-year history of that journal. That's about 1,500 articles that we read. And we arrayed those in a visualization that showed the number of times those key terms appeared in a given year. So you really can see at sort of one glance, what have historians of, at least of Florida history, been interested in? What have they written about? And how has that changed over time? As I said, we turned that then into a physical sculpture. We 3D printed that visualization, turned it into a physical sculpture. And it, in fact, was part of a show here at the Lumos Gallery in Columbus in December. And so it was the first time I'd ever had a gallery showing. But it shows some interesting directions that digital history can be taking, not just simply working with computers, but actually in creating new kinds of objects. Maybe they're art objects, maybe they're design objects. But the idea is exploring new ways of thinking about and representing the past. Another project I'm working on is doing that same sort of keyword or word frequency analysis of the American Historical Review, which is the leading journal in history. And it was first published in the 1880s. And so we're doing a similar sort of analysis of the key terms across the 120-some year history of that journal. We're going to be turning that into a large-scale installation. In fact, our plan is to install it in the rotunda of Sullivan Hall here on campus and possibly some other locations as well. But the designs that we're developing now have it that this is going to be about a 2-story, 20 diameter sort of object. And again, as part of my interest in this idea of representing historical ideas, not necessarily through writing or not through our traditional means, a written article or a book or even a paper read aloud at a conference. What are other alternative ways that we can represent our ideas and experience our ideas of the past? I've also just started a research project on historical imagination. And this is a question that I've been wrestling with for the better part of a dozen years or so. A colleague about that time asked me, a colleague in another department asked me, how much imagination are historians permitted? And my first response was, well, none, because we're historians. We don't deal with the imagination. And then I immediately backtracked from that because it's quite clear that historians do use their imagination. And so the work I'm doing is exploring what that means. How do historians use their imagination? And perhaps more importantly, I'm interested to know at what stage do we think that an historian has gone too far, has become too imaginative? Where is that place? At what stage does an imaginative history become too much like historical fiction? Can we sort of figure out where that is? Because historians always use their imagination. We draw inferences from our evidence. It's a common part of the way in which we study the past. But I'm particularly interested to know how far we can stretch our inferences. How far can we extend our imaginations? And in what ways are historians doing that? I also teach classes in digital history, introducing students to digital methods. I teach a senior research symposium on the theme of historical imagination. And so a lot of the ideas that I'm wrestling with and working with in my own research find their way into my classroom teaching as well. And in fact, as I'm working through those issues with my students, I learned a great deal that I'm able to bring then into my research. And so teaching and research I see as very much intimately connected. One of the things I like about teaching our Introduction to Historical Methods class is that they tend to be smaller. We cap them at 20 students. And I use that as an occasion then not to come in and lecture. In fact, I do very little lecturing in that class. We rearrange the class into a circle typically, and I'll assign a reading or some sort of assignment like that, where students have to make their own sorts of interpretations. And then we come into class and have a conversation. My role in that situation really is more like an orchestra conductor. And when it works, we actually produce quite beautiful music. That's really pushing the analogy a bit. But giving students the opportunity to investigate for themselves, giving students the opportunity to think and express ideas for themselves, rather than simply listening to lectures, I think is an important part of the teaching that I do. I try to convey that sense of excitement about history as a form of inquiry, history as a way of knowing about the world, not just simply content, not just simply that we know lots of interesting things about the past, which we do, but how we go about investigating it, the way in which historians ask and answer really interesting and complex questions is part of what I try to convey to my students. I think that being an historian means being an inquirer, and there's all kinds of possibilities for inquirers, I think, in the world.